Hey everyone, I'm Eric Olander, managing editor of the China Africa Project website and podcast, and I'm joined by my co-founder and co-host, Cobus van Staden from the South African Institute of International Affairs in Johannesburg, South Africa. Hey, good morning, Cobus.
Good morning.
So today we're going to be doing something a little bit differently. Normally, you and I are recording podcasts together and writing a newsletter, but today we're doing a video for journalists who are now being asked to cover the China-Africa story. And this little video that we're putting together is mostly for reporters, producers, and other editorial staff who are really new to the China-Africa story. So we're going to bring some insights from the past 10 years that you and I have been doing this to hopefully help some other reporters who may be new to the topic. Now, this is a really exciting time in China-Africa coverage, in part because there is more news than ever. You and I put together a newsletter every day that includes dozens and dozens and dozens of stories on everything from politics, arts, culture, sports, economics, debt, racism, discrimination. I mean, the range of topics now has gotten so incredibly diverse compared to what it was 5 years ago, 10 years ago, that it actually is both an opportunity because there's a lot to write about, but also a really big challenge.
Yes, on the one hand, it's great, kind of because more issues are getting covered in more detail. But on the other hand, we're also seeing in kind of rush to cover the relationship that frequently a lot of misinformation kind of gets mixed into all of the coverage. And especially when there's so many stories emerging every day, it starts getting really difficult to keep tabs on what is actually true and what isn't.
Okay, so let's go ahead with our tips and tricks. Hopefully no tricks, but lots of tips. We're going to give practical, actionable tips for journalists on how to better improve their coverage of China, Africa. Each of us are going to give 2 tips each. Cobus, let's start with your recommendation for what you think would help a journalist in covering the China, Africa story.
It's a basic one, but a really important one. Is just basically don't assume that the China-Africa relationship is unique. Because we frequently tend to think of the China-Africa relationship as this thing that is kind of emerged 20 years ago and is completely rewriting the rules on how Africa is engaging with the rest of the world. In some cases, that's true. In some cases, you really do see new innovative ways or kind of like new problems emerging. But in other cases, a lot of particularly the problems in the China-Africa relationship are continuations of problems that Africa has faced before. So, for example, if you're looking at environmental practice, frequently you would, when you speak to Western actors or Western diplomats, they would assure you that, kind of Western companies are above board. There's rules of engagement. There's all kinds of ethical standards. Everything's fine. And sure, in many cases it is, and it's been for the last 5 years. And when you look at practice before that, frequently there were exactly the same problems with Western actors as there are with Chinese actors. So it's safer to look at international standards, to look at precedent, to see how different the relationship actually is. Parts of it will be different, but there's a good chance that the big parts of it will actually be similar to the way that Western actors act in Africa as well.
Yeah, and my tip is actually very similar to that in some extent, is that, again, this will be my first insight. Number one is the fact that people will come to the China-Africa story with a lot of embedded narratives. And what that means is that if you think that China is the worst thing that's ever happened to Africa, you can find all of the evidence that you want to support it. Everything from environmental degradation to illegal migration to the debt issues, all of those are terrible. And you can find a lot of evidence to support that case. Similarly, if you think that China is the best thing that's ever happened to Africa, the building of infrastructure, the breaking of the dynamics between Europe and Africa and adding new power in the terms of African agency to negotiate, all the infrastructure, of course, that's been brought to the continent. There's been enormous advances in trade, Huawei phones, techno, all of those great things. Those are all cool. That's great. Again, you can find the story that you want. The challenge for a reporter, though, is to question those embedded narratives and to really ask, is that really the whole story? Because if you're saying that the China-Africa relationship is all good or all bad, I tend to think that you're missing half the story. And it's the complexity of this relationship that really makes it very, very interesting. So one of the things that we like to say that when we give talks or on our podcast is we like to leave our readers, our viewers, our listeners more confused than when they started with us. And normally that's not a good thing. But in this particular case, it's a really, really good thing because the story is complicated and contradictory. And that's one of the things that really should come out of the coverage, that it's really not binary or black or white, or it just doesn't divide neatly on good versus evil. There's both sides that sit side by side with one another. Okay, Cobus, what is your second and final tip?
It is to take into account the complexity of the relationship and particularly the number of players involved. So I would stay away from, a concept like the Chinese. Because there are so many different Chinese actors and so many of them have competing and contradictory agendas. So it's really important to be clear about who's involved. And in relation to that, it's really important to not let African governments off the hook. African governments have a lot more power in the China-Africa relationship than they frequently like to pretend themselves. And when you speak to African government officials, they can easily be saying things like, "Oh, the Chinese they have so much money, they have so much power, or what can Africa do?" And it's very easy to then just slip into this kind of stereotype of Africa as this passive actor that just gets acted upon. So let me make it clear, like almost every bad kind of outcome of a China-Africa relationship is be that environmental, human rights, bad debt, like bad infrastructure choices, or always any kind of China-Africa problem, some African government official signed off on it. Like there's almost always some African government official involved. This isn't necessarily at the highest level. These officials could frequently be at the provincial level, at the local government or small town level. But there's almost always some kind of African official who said yes to something. And so if you're working in Africa, then that becomes your job, to find those officials and to hold them accountable.
That's great. That's just such a great insight on that. My final point and tip here for our discussion today is going to be about getting a wide range and diverse voices into the discussion. In particular, one of the things that's missing from a lot of news reporting on the Chinese in Africa are Chinese voices. Now, Chinese voices are not easy to include in the story. Let's be very upfront. The Chinese embassies and consulates in Africa are very, very press averse, very press shy. Very difficult to get comments from them. Oftentimes, Chinese companies are very difficult to get them to comment. But that really is not an excuse not to have a Chinese perspective in it, because if you only have, say, African voices and international voices, particularly from US and Europe, you're missing, again, a big part of the story. So it's not easy, but it can be done. In terms of finding those voices, you want to look to NGOs, you want to look to academics, you want to look to various think tanks, Chinese actors who are in other parts of the world. So maybe there's a Chinese scholar in the UK. They may be more willing to speak than, say, a China scholar in Beijing, who is often very reluctant to speak. So, but having Chinese voices is really important in the discussion. The other part of this is not just getting old people like us, old white people like us. We need to get younger people, more women, more diverse voices in the stories to be sourced, in part because these stories affect a generation of young people. The median age in Africa is 19.7 years old. It's so important to have those voices. Also in China, the huge gap between the young generation and the old generation simply cannot be told if you're only talking to people over 40. So it's really important to get diversity in terms of gender, diversity in terms of point of view, geography, ethnicity, and age. So not just going back to the same think tanks in Washington and London and Paris who have all too often commented on these stories, really kind of dialed down some of what we call in the webinar world, the WANels, the all white panels, or the manels, all the male panels, to have that diversity. And that is critical in the coverage. Cobus, some final thoughts to you and tips and tricks for reporters covering the China-Africa story.
Well, kind of keep in mind that one of your core audiences are young African people. So Africa, obviously, everyone's always says this. Africa is a very young continent, which means that's also a continent that is really looking towards the future. China is going to be a really big player in Africa's future. But the kind of player it's going to be is still to be decided, and it will be decided by young African people. So whatever happens, young African people will have to, in some kind of way, either give their consent, or they would have to, kind of like show that they don't agree with whatever decision has been made. So in a way, your job is to inform those young African decision makers, and to keep their voices on board, because as we all know, in Africa, it's very easy for old government officials or old leaders to simply ride roughshod over the majority of the population who is much younger. So I think I would leave you with the idea that as many young African voices as possible need to be represented.
And on the Chinese voices part, one thing that I've overlooked to mention, there are two great databases that I want to bring your attention to. One is the New Voices. New in Chinese is female. And they've got this fantastic database. I'll put the link down in the show notes of this video, and of China scholars and experts who are all women. And so that is a great resource for you to be able to call and look for, expert sourcing on all range of different topics related to China. Also, at the China Africa Project, we have an experts directory that's available. It's got about 150, 200 different guests and sources that are listed there. All of them indicate in their bio if they are media and press friendly, and most of them are. And we have a nice range of both Chinese and African sources that you can contact there as well. Also, if you have questions in your reporting and your coverage, feel free to reach out to Cobus or myself. We'll put our email addresses down in the show notes as well. We always like working with journalists to help improve China-Africa coverage. So that'll do it for our 2 tips and tricks each on how to improve your China-Africa coverage. We look forward to reading your stories and featuring them in our newsletter on all things related to China-Africa. Thanks so much for joining us.
Thanks so much.